I'm thinking about divorcing her.
My kids are out of control.
I'm not hurting anyone with my choices.
I thought they were my friends.
Should I quit my job?
I'm just gonna wing it.
I don't want to work anymore.
Follow your passion.
Believe you can do it and you will.
Everything happens for a reason.
Fake it till you make it.
Be yourself.
Take risk.
Never give up.
Howdy, mister. Me and my buddies have to build a new clubhouse. We need to buy some lumber.
What kind?
Wood. We took up a collection. Get us all the wood you can for this much, please.
Paper or plastic?
$450 for lumber? Where are we gonna get that kind of moolah? I don't know. You know what they say, wood doesn't grow on trees. Hey, you guys, come here. All in favor? Say yo 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 yo. Thank you, my good man.
Six kids, hard-working father, honest and trustworthy, loan denied.
Hello, my good man.
Gentlemen, have a seat.
Can we sit down? Are you kidding? We can't sit down, my good man.
Now, what may I do for you?
We want to take out a hefty loan.
Of course. Do you have an account with us?
And how?
What is your account number?
7.
7.
Try 8. 8?
Heard enough.
Ouch!
If you were my kids, I'd punish you.
If we were your kids, we could punish ourselves.
Leave the premises post haste.
You can't treat people this way, mister.
You're not people. You're kids.
Thank you. Good luck.
Good luck indeed. Although I have never watched the movie The Little Rascals from beginning to end, it is hard to believe it has already been 30 years since it was first released. But what makes that reality come into focus is hearing that you could actually buy the materials for building a treehouse for $450. That's probably what they would actually charge for delivery nowadays. And as I say that, people that are older than me can probably recall a time when that price would have already sounded absurd, $450 for a treehouse. If there is anyone in the room or even online that is old enough to remember the 1950s, in 1950, Ford released their first half-ton truck, the F1. There was no 50 behind it. The F1, and it could be purchased for a whopping $1,287. Now, there may be people, once again, watching online or people that are here in the room that may remember that time. If you were to look at the cheapest Ford truck that there is in the market today, you would come across, which actually sounds like a pretty good deal, but it's the 2024 Ford Maverick XL that has a starting price of $24,995, $20,000 over what it was before. One of the things that we know is that with time, things have gotten more expensive. Or maybe it's a matter of perspective. In the state of Minnesota, the minimum wage varies currently, and it's based according to what a business brings in. On the low end of that minimum wage in 2024, currently this year, in the state of Minnesota, the minimum wage, depending on what a business makes, the lowest end is $7.75. Compare that to 1950, when the minimum wage was $7 under that. If you lived in 1950 and you wanted to purchase this F1, you would have been making 75 cents an hour. As the cost of living has gone up, the minimum wage has also gone up with it. The things that costed less back then cost more now. Because with the rise of expenses, so there has also been a rise in the income. So let's go back just for reference to the F1 truck in 1950. If you were to take that truck that costs over $1,000, once you adjust for inflation, if you were to buy that same truck today, it would actually cost, because of inflation, $12,968.21. Now, some of you may be saying that's still half the price of what the cheapest Ford today would cost you, and you would be correct in that. But one of the things that we begin to see is that what seems to be easy for us to picture, I could pay for that cash today, we actually see that we would still probably require some kind of loan to be able to buy that truck if we were to be living in the 1950s, because inflation plays with that number. While it may feel this morning, it may feel like you are back in high school sitting through an economics class all over again, the Bible talks a lot about money. And it gives us wisdom in making decisions that can financially bankrupt us or even financially put a strain on us. According to the website, wallethub.com, around 23% of Americans are debt-free. So out of 100%, 23% don't have anything that they owe money on. Out of the remaining percentage of Americans, according to Forbes.com, a 2023 survey conducted by payroll.org highlighted that 78% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck. I believe that a fair statement to make would be that the majority of Americans do not know how to manage their money, the money that they actually make, and are financially in debt or strained paying back money that they had to borrow. That would be a fair assessment in regards to these two statistics. Which brings us to today's topic of how we live foolish. And this is every American, myself included. Once again, there is a percentage of people, but nonetheless, there's other areas that we live foolishly. But the area that we're talking about today is how we are enslaved by our foolish decisions that lack wisdom. So this is, in a nutshell, what we're talking about. Proverbs chapter 22, verse 7 puts it this way. Just as the rich rule the poor, so the borrower is servant to the lender. We become slaves because we are forced to work to pay back to the banks the money that we borrowed. Because we know that if we don't pay that money back, they would take everything that we have acquired until they get every single penny and dime back that we borrowed. When you put it into layman's terms, not to the extreme of what we often envision when we think about the word slave, but we are slaves in our society as a result of our foolishness. Again, there's no physical ball and chain, there's no whip involved, but metaphorically speaking, right, the borrower is a servant to the lender. While there is no physical bar chain and there's no whip involved, we are metaphorically slaves because we understand that we are living from paycheck to paycheck. So we are forced to wake up each morning and go to work to keep the things that we have borrowed against. Also to keep the collection agencies off of our backs. The borrower It's a servant. It's a slave. We are slaves to the lender. The quick, obvious solution to the problem of our debt is more money. But as I stated a while back, the answer is actually not more money. It is figuring out how to manage the money that we do have. The issue with our debts are often easy to pinpoint. It often starts with either wanting the things that our parents had, or maybe even the things that our parents were unable to give us. We know that we can afford it if we are able to break it down into small chunks. We can't afford it to pay for it right off the bat, so we live in a culture that actually gives us a great opportunity, the opportunity to buy now and pay later. Take it home with you today and just make small payments, and eventually you'll pay it off. So we borrow not according to what we make, we borrow according to what we can pay back every month. So hear me out when I say this, because it's going to sound like I'm going to take this a different direction, and it's not. But that's not where the foolishness lies. It's not in the monthly payment. I know that there are people that I've met in the past, and maybe even people that are here in our service today, that have a personal conviction against every and any kind of loan. I understand that. But I believe that there are times where things have to be weighed out, and we actually see that there is actually wisdom in making decisions that might put us in a position of getting a loan. So once again, the issue, I believe, is not the loan itself, it's how we move forward in that path. And we easily see the difficulty when it comes to home mortgages. I'll give you a personal example. When my wife and I got married nearly 20 years ago, it'll be 20 years this December, we decided to rent an apartment, and it was located in a low-income housing. Now, we decided to move into Perham, and the location wasn't bad. I mean, we were definitely not in anything extravagant. But at the time, I believe that we were paying just a little over $450 a month for this apartment. When we first got married, we had talked about living in Minnesota for a time and then moving back to Texas, where I grew up. However, after moving up here, we talked about it and we made the decision that we were going to stay here in Minnesota. Now, when that happened, we decided to really evaluate where we were at in regards to this process of renting. Just because it felt like we were throwing money into something that we were never going to see a return on. So after sitting down with my father-in-law, who did construction for a living, we agreed on just doing a simple floor house plan. And it was going to be a small house, nothing big, nothing fancy, no garage, no entryway, not even a concrete slab outside. It was just simply a house that would ultimately accommodate to be able to start a family. We decided to move forward with this building of the house, and we're currently still living in it. And once we finished everything for the original structure, which is just a rambler house, it's a small house, and it was 2,016 square feet, that's basement and living space on the top floor, we actually ended up borrowing $70,000 total. And that broke down to a monthly mortgage payment that was actually cheaper than what we were paying to rent. Once again, it seemed like the wise thing to do. We're either going to pay this indefinitely for something that we're never going to see a return on, or if not, we can actually borrow money and build a house that we can actually call our own. We felt like we were just throwing money into something we're never going to see a return on, and we did our homework. And even though we were committed to 30 years, it still ended up being less than what we would have been paying at that time. So before I go any further with this, I just want to add, because I think it's extremely important, that if you live in an apartment or you're renting, this is not me suggesting that you should do your homework and go and buy a house. That's not what I'm saying by any stretch of the imagination. because as we're going to be talking about, there's a number of things that you have to consider along the way. But for us, at that time, we realized that we were going to be paying the same amount, which we could afford, and the only difference was that by building, with time, we would have something to call our own. Interestingly enough, at the time, I wasn't even considering, maybe my wife did, but I wasn't even considering inflation or even how the apartment rentals would go up. Now, while the house is under our name, the bank is also on it, and we're still paying for it. But since we first took out that loan, the loan has changed a number of times as we've added. So once again, it's a play with numbers. But by the time that we are done paying back the amount, even if we're just to go with that original loan amount, the bank will end up getting a significantly more than what we borrowed for our house. And that is because of something that is known as interest. While I do not regret the decision that we made as a couple 20 years ago to build a house, what often happens is that people, myself included, we often buy without realizing how much we're actually paying to borrow. The biggest thing we often take into consideration when buying something is actually the monthly payment. Can we actually make the payment? We don't think about how much more we are going to pay for that loan. So let's just say you buy something for $20,000. You don't consider how much you're actually paying in the long run. So something that varies, and it's increased within the last couple of years, is the interest rate. This is typically a number, not all the time, but typically it's under 10, and it's got the percentage sign behind it. And we see those numbers, and they don't scare us because they're low enough. That is until we begin to put things into perspective. What that small number will end up adding to. Now, I wasn't really good at economics, so I want to put it into perspective with some points of reference, right? So just to kind of get an idea of what this looks like. So let's pretend for a second that you could build a house for $100,000. More realistically, that would simply get you a loan that would be enough to build the tree house that the Little Rascals wanted to build. Nonetheless, let's just pretend that for $100,000, you could actually build a house from foundation to everything that's outside. And I'm going to show you all this information in just a second. But right now, if you were to do a quick search, which you're going to see that picture in just a second, the current fixed rate for a 30-year loan is 7.04%. And once again, that number will vary. It goes up from there. Relatively speaking, generally speaking, 7 is a pretty low number in comparison to 100. When you take all those things into consideration, this is how it breaks down. Now, this is not even adding the 0.04% into that rate, but if you were to ask for $100,000 with a 30-year term at 7%, what you would end up paying, the number that is there, not the big, not the 100,000, the 139,508, that is not actually what you're paying. That's actually just the interest on the $100,000, which means that on top of the $100,000 that you are borrowing, you will actually end up paying $139,508.90, which will bring your grand total to, let's just pretend for a second, you bought a house for $100,000, you will end up paying $239,508.90 for the house that you thought costed you $100,000. So once again, this is something that helps us to see things in perspective. And if you don't have the money to buy something and you borrow, you have to understand that the longer that you pay, the more that you're paying in interest. And even though you may be living in poverty from paycheck to paycheck, you are paying to the lender. So the verse makes a lot of sense. The borrower is a servant to the lender. The borrower is a slave to the lender. We're working to make somebody rich by the things that we're acquiring. That's wisdom. Now, there's a number of scenarios, as I mentioned, that you could actually go through and say, but the loan makes sense in this point in time. And I get it. We can't go through the logistics of every scenario. And honestly, as a husband, as a dad, looking back at when we first built the house, I don't know that we could have ever saved enough money to build a house while working to provide for our family. I get that. I understand that difficulty. But here is the problem in our society, and this is myself included. Even when trying to make wise decisions in light of how we can invest into the future rather than spending with no return, I have seen people who will start with that idea on building a house, and they're looking for something that is small, that will suit their family. And by the time that they're done, they get this blueprint, and it looks like something that just popped out of a magazine, right? It's incredible. Their entire garage is the size of their house. And once again, they're just trying to be modest in what they're buying. Their entire, or maybe this would be a better way to put it, their kids' bedrooms is probably bigger than some of our houses. They only have 2 bedrooms, but nonetheless, they're ginormous. So it almost becomes like the bills that our government passes, right? We're trying to be modest, and there's something good in there, but at the same time, we're just throwing a bunch of stuff that's just adding to that bill. There's a lot of wasteful spending enrolled into a bill that maybe can make sense. So it's people that are saying, I would rather just really invest into something that I'm going to own, but along the way, you're throwing so many things in there that are really foolish. They're not the greatest things to invest into. And that's just one example, right? There's many examples as to how we can make foolish decisions, even when thinking we are making wise ones. And just like with that, another issue is that even if we don't borrow to live extravagantly, we often don't simply borrow for the things that we need, like a place to live, sleep, and eat. We borrow for the things that we want. And once again, we stretch that need to what we want. We need a vehicle to get from point A to point B, but what's a monthly payment that I can get by and still live off of? We live in Minnesota, and the banker says that you can afford another payment. We need a boat, right? We live in Minnesota. There's 10,000 lakes to pick from. Once again, none of these things are bad to have. As a matter of fact, it's fine if you want to have that. Nothing wrong with it. But they aren't wise to have if you can't afford them. Growing up in Texas, everyone looks like they are CEOs in this mega corporation. But growing up in that culture, I can tell you that it is more about appearance than reality. Sadly enough, it is often people living from paycheck to paycheck that are drowning in debt. They fall into this category. Some who are poor pretend to be rich. Others who are rich pretend to be poor. While there may be scenarios where a loan may be required, we often live paycheck to paycheck because we are indebted to the lender, pretending to be something that we're not. Again, the issue is that we don't just borrow for what we need. It is that we borrow for what we want. If we were just to go back to that interest of $100,000 that you're going to be paying, the reality is, if you were to look at that number of $130,000, some Americans, the average American, will not even make that in 2 or 3 years. So if we put it into perspective, average Americans that owe that much, $100,000, and they're not going to pay it off any sooner, we will be working for 2 or 3 years for free to pay off something that we could have actually saved for. Again, there are scenarios that make sense, But if we're honest, most of our purchases don't. We fall into the category of what James chapter 4, verse 2 talks about. People who want what they don't have and are jealous of what others have. There are people who aspire to be rich and devote their lives to making money, and there are others who aspire to find fulfillment through material things that leads them to having to sacrifice every other area of their lives simply to pay for what they borrowed. These are areas that often bring stress that the Bible addresses. Because every area that is out of balance in our lives will lead to friction in other places. While there are a number of issues that can lead to divorce, and among them, one of them is money, and it's actually pretty close to the top. There are things that create friction in our marriage, and money is one, which is the reason that the Bible addresses money so often. We live in a society with so much to offer to keep us busy, entertained, or even to facilitate how we're doing things, but it all takes money. And when we don't have money, there's always loans. This system is ingrained into the very fabric of our society. Again, the issue is not how we approach the things that we need, but the positions that we're willing to put ourselves in with the things that we desire. We live in a society where everything is easily accessible, easily available, but it all comes with interest. As individuals, we are going poor simply paying for interest. Which is why the Bible not only addresses the realities of loans and debt, but also the topic of interest, as we've been talking about. There are parts of the Bible that we come across that are hard for us to wrestle through, and there's other ones that seem outdated to some people. But then there are parts that, no matter how outdated they sound, we wish that they could be practiced today. And what we're about to talk about is no exception. In the book of Deuteronomy, God gives certain commands and instructions that are established to care for those in need. And it's ethics and how we treat one another. Verses 19 through 20 of Deuteronomy chapter 23 records this command, and it says, "Do not charge interest on the loans you make to a fellow Israelite, whether you loan money or food or anything else. You may charge interest to foreigners, but you may not charge interest to Israelites, so that the Lord your God may bless you in everything you do in the land that you are about to enter and occupy." Any banker that is listening to this just tuned out. But let's dive into that passage a little bit further as we wrap up. While the argument can be made that it is a command given to the nation of Israel, not to every other person, the truth is that as people of faith, we are grafted into that promise, and spiritually, we're children of Abraham. That's what the Bible says. Not only that, once again, we can't apply everything that is written in the Old Testament, but if you were to just see this objectively, this command, we can actually see that this could be applied today just as simple as it was applied back then. Interest is not to be charged to any type of loan of those within that nation or that group of Israelites. However, it is permissible to charge interest on those who are not Israelites. And this sounds exclusive because it is. It's a command given for the nation of Israel. An article written by Kevin DeYoung on the Gospel Coalition website puts it well when he says, one thing you must not do is give them a loan with interest, right? That's the command. The situation calls for charity. It is not an opportunity for making money at the expense of someone else's misfortune. So does that mean that it's okay to take advantage of people who are not Israelites, or for practical application, that are not Christians, because we're okay with being able to charge interest on people that are not Christians? No, that's not what it's getting at. Here is something that can be said about borrowing, and that is that at times people take advantage or exploit others by profiting off of their difficulties. People that need money and they see it, and we see this even within the church. It is within the ability of someone to do it, but they say, well, I can help you, but maybe you could just pay me this extra percentage on top of it. So understand that if it is within your ability to help someone in need, don't take advantage of it by seeing an opportunity to get ahead off of someone's misfortune. That's really the key. So building off of the topic of interest, Proverbs chapter 27, verse 13, again, gives some insight and wisdom when it comes to loans. It says, get security from someone who guarantees a stranger's debt. Get a deposit if he does it for foreigners. And the reason that this is important is because when it comes to debt, not only do most Americans find themselves sinking under the weight of their debt, but at times we may even find some people who are financially stable but put themselves at a financial risk for others. We may very well be the people who are guaranteeing someone else's debt that they may not be able to pay, and this is called co-signers. Trying to establish credit is difficult, no doubt about it. We have an 18-year-old. We understand it's difficult when you're trying to kind of start that process, and that's because nobody wants to borrow money unless you have someone, or unless you have some credit, which is going to be difficult to find, or someone who is willing to co-sign for you and guarantee that that loan will be paid for that you're asking money for. There's other avenues that are a little bit risky, like getting credit cards, which typically have high interest rates. So because of these different scenarios, kids are forced to ask parents if they're willing to sign for them. Now, in more extreme cases, friends ask other friends to sign for them. I also know of a few situations where a guy co-signed for this girl that he was dating, and after the relationship ended, so did the payments to the bank, and the guy was stuck with the bill. So here's another word of wisdom. Don't agree to guarantee another person's debt or put up security for someone else. If you can't pay it, even your bed will be snatched from under you. Your friends, relatives, or ex-girlfriend's debt, if it's not paid, it becomes your debt. And once again, these are just simple ways that the Bible's telling us be wise in how you're spending your money and what you're asking for in regards to loans and that interest. And I understand everyone in the room manages money very differently. Our income varies. But in a practical way, here's the wisdom that we can take from today. The answer is not more money, but learning how to manage what we have. Live as far away from the limit of what you make, because you're not guaranteed to have the job that you did. And only borrow for what you need and for what you can pay back. While the interest rates are currently outrageous and ungodly, the interest rate is not the sole issue of the culture today, of our problems today. The issue is magnified by the things that we are paying interest on, the many things that we're paying interest on. So again, the borrower is a slave to the lender. And the Bible gives us wisdom that will free us from the shackles of debt and allow us to live without financial strain and be able to live in a way that we can be generous with others. Let's pray.